I survived 2 days and nights in the wilderness in northeastern North America in the dead of winter with two friends. We had limited supplies and no tents. We built our own shelters with mainly natural materials, drank water we filtered from the stream, and gathered our own firewood, all in sub-freezing temperatures, with a snowstorm incoming on the second night. When we arrived on the first day, we looked around for a good place to set up. We found a flat patch on a hill, which would provide ample area for building, was partially insulated from the wind, and was only about 30 feet away from a small stream, which we could use for drinking water with filter straws. Upon arriving, we set out to work on our respective shelters. My plan was to build a debris hut, which would consist of a frame with sticks as walls to support the debris, then would be covered in copious amounts of leaves and other debris. Done properly, the debris hut would not merely keep out any snow, but would also be decently warm. My friend Charlie and his brother Robert planned to use bark, which would theoretically be as effective against the snow, but not as much so against the cold. Here you can see our shelters laid on the first afternoon. My shelter is the one on the left, Charlie's the one in the middle, was supposed to be a similar shape to mine. Robert's was the largest. Having access to knives, axes, and a saw, the frames went up quickly. Our luck rapidly ran out there, however. Thanks to rough terrain, especially near our camp, gathering the considerable amount of leaves my debris hut would need proved to be very time-consuming, and the bark wasn't any better. As darkness fell and the forest around us grew almost pitch black, our shelters were nowhere near completed. In this unenviable situation, I tried what was, in the scheme of our situation, a fairly bold plan. With only my flashlight for light, I set out into the forest in search of a leafy plant that I could use to finish my shelter. After walking what was, given the darkness and terrain, a half-decent distance, I found some mountain laurel, a bush-like plant that still had green leaves in winter, which I gathered and brought back to camp. Alas, the mountain laurel didn't work well for my shelter, and my bold plan ended in some mountain laurel abandoned by our camp. Meanwhile, Charlie and Robert were working on a fire and encountering issues of their own. We had lighters and paper for tinder, but the kindling we were using was cold and damp and would not easily catch. We had a cheap plastic tablecloth, and my next idea was to use it to help gather leaves. I took it to a nearby area free of obstructions, where I'd be able to gather the leaves more quickly, then collected leaves on the tablecloth and used it to carry them back to my shelter. With this innovation, I was able to gather leaves significantly faster, and, with the help of some space blankets tossed atop my shelter, I had a warm shelter for the first night, with the admitted downside of a leaf occasionally falling onto my face. With a good coat, a sleeping bag probably wouldn't have even been necessary. Charlie and Robert eventually got the fire to catch, but our position was still far from ideal. Charlie's shelter was little more than a frame, and Robert's had a roof but no walls. Even mine, warm though it was, would likely not stand up to snow. We were in an okay position for the first night, but we were not ready for the snow that was to come the second. On the second day, I doubled down, gathering more leaves for my shelter using my new method. I took my shelter apart, down to the frame, and rebuilt it. After some trial and error, I found a good design. On top of my frame, I used space blankets as a liner. While they would do little for structure, they would help with insulation. The space blankets weren't necessary, but they were helpful. On top of them, I re-added the stick walls, then piled even more debris than before back on top. By the early afternoon, I had a shelter that was, though small, satisfactory. Charlie and Robert, meanwhile, decided to consolidate their efforts, since Robert's shelter was big enough for both of them. With my occasional help, they gathered more bark, hoping to have enough to add walls to their shelter by the night. As dark drew nearer, and we used most nearby trees with good bark, their quest to get enough bark seemed more and more unlikely to succeed. And that's when we noticed the discarded mountain laurel sitting at the edge of our camp. We quickly returned to the patch and gathered more, which they affixed to their shelter. We made another fire, this time taking special care to find dry kindling so it would catch more easily, and as a dusting of snow was beginning to accumulate on the ground, we went to bed. I woke warm and dry, and stepped out of my shelter to see a gorgeous forest blanketed in snow. Our shelters had both held against the snow, and our flag still flew above our camp. After drinking some icy stream water and packing up, we hiked triumphantly out of the snowy woods.